I can feel the rough hemp against my throat. The autumn wind cuts through Coldwater's town square, carrying the scent of wood smoke and fear. Below me 12 men stand in silence. Their faces blur in the morning light, but I know each one. I built their plows, I shod their horses. 10 years ago I called them neighbors. Mayor Caleb Harrow holds the lever, waiting for the church bell to strike 9. They say I kidnapped Harrison's daughter. They say I burned the warehouse to hide the evidence. They say I am the mountain monster they always knew I was. But nobody asks why a man who lived alone for 10 years would suddenly walk into town in broad daylight, carrying a blood-soaked ledger. The bell begins to toll. 1, 2, I close my eyes, not because I fear death, but because I need to remember how it all began. 3 days earlier, when she fell from the sky. 3 days earlier. The autumn wind carried the smell of snow coming. I knelt beside the tracks of a bull elk, my fingers trembling, not from cold, but because this was the only motion left that made me feel human. Then I heard the scream, not an animal, a person, a woman. The scream cut off suddenly. That silence was worse than any sound. I ran toward it through the pines, my boots crushing fallen needles, my breath forming clouds in the thin mountain air. The eastern cliff face came into view. I dropped to my knees at the edge and looked down. A woman lay in a patch of golden leaves 30 yards below, her body twisted at angles that bodies should not twist. Beyond her, 200 yards down the slope, I saw them. Mayor Harrow, 12 men, rifles, or horses. They were not climbing up to help her. They were watching, waiting. 10 years ago, they accused me of killing my apprentice. There was no body, no weapon. Only the word of one man, Caleb Harrow. They drove me up this mountain with curses and thrown stones. I did not run because I was afraid. I ran because if I stayed, I would become the monster they believed I was. Now, if I went down to save this woman, they would say I kidnapped her. If I let her die, they would say I killed her. But there was one thing they had not counted on. I no longer cared what they said. I slid down the cliff face, loose rocks skittering beneath my boots. The woman lay motionless, but her chest rose and fell in shallow gasps. Blood seeped through the torn fabric of her dress at the thigh. Her hip jutted at a wrong angle. From below, someone laughed. I reached her side and knelt. Up close I could see her face. Young, maybe 27. Dark brown hair escaping from pins. Eyes that should have been filled with fear, but instead held something else. Recognition. She looked at me, not with terror, as I expected. Her brown eyes were sharp, intelligent, studying me like I was a book written in a language she was trying to learn. "You are Nathaniel Dalton," she whispered. It was not a question. It was confirmation. "You should not be here," I said. "I know," she answered, gasping as pain shot through her. "But this is the only place I could find you." I stopped. My hands hovered over her injured hip. "You fell here on purpose?" She nodded, then cried out when I touched her side. She told me, between gasps of pain, that she had climbed the cliff knowing I hunted in this area. She could not come to my cabin because men were following her. So she jumped. She calculated the height, aimed for the bushes that would cushion her fall. Enough to injure herself, but not to die. "I needed you to trust me enough to listen," she said. "And mountain men only trust what they see. You see me hurt. Now you will hear me." This woman had just gambled her life on the chance that a hermit would appear at the right moment. She was either insane or so desperate that insanity became rational. I placed my hands on her hip, breathed deep, then I pulled. Her scream echoed across the mountain. Some of the men below flinched. The bones slid back into place with a sound like a branch snapping. She collapsed against the earth, shaking. I wrapped the wound on her thigh with strips torn from my shirt. As I worked, my fingers touched something hard inside her wool stocking. I pulled it free, a small leather journal, old, stained with dried blood. Not her fresh blood. Blood that had been there for years. On the back cover was a mark carved into the leather, a howling wolf. I recognized it immediately. The memory hit me like a fist. Jacob, my 16-year-old apprentice. 10 years ago, he liked to carve wolves on everything. I taught him blacksmithing. One morning, he vanished. No trace. Harrow said he ran away. A week later, Harrow accused me of killing Jacob to cover up theft. My father died because of that ledger, the woman said. Her name, she told me, was Rosalie Harrison. People called her Rose. They said he had a stroke, but I saw the bruises around his neck. And Jacob, the boy you used to teach, he gave this ledger to my father the night before he disappeared. From down the mountain, Harrow's voice cut through the air. Dalton, let Miss Harrison go. She is unwell. You are making this worse. I lifted Rose into my arms. She was lighter than I expected, or perhaps I had grown stronger from years of carrying firewood and game. I did not walk down the mountain toward the men with their rifles and their certain version of justice. I walked up, higher into the pines, deeper into the territory they feared. Rose whispered against my chest. They will kill you. They tried 10 years ago, I answered. I am still here. The cabin appeared through the trees, not the den of bones and blood that their stories painted, just logs chinked with mud, a stone fireplace, shelves lined with books salvaged from my old life, medical instruments wrapped in clean cloth, a small bed against one wall, and hanging on a wooden peg near the door, a child's coat, sized for someone about 10 years old but cared for, not a speck of dust on it. Rose noticed it but did not ask. She just looked at it, then at me. I turned away and laid her gently on the bed. I opened the ledger with careful hands. Inside were lists, copper mine, dates, money marked as accident compensation, 11 names. Beside each name, a notation. Refused terms. Accepted. Those who refused had red X marks and dates written beside them. One line stood out. Jacob Thorne, refused warrant E.H. Missing August 9, 1876. Edwin Harrison, warned by J.T., investigating. Died November 3, 1886. Rose explained, her voice steady despite the pain. Her father owned the largest copper mine in the region. 10 years ago, there was a string of accidents. 14 people died over 2 years. Her father suspected they were not accidents. Jacob worked in the mine and saw someone cutting support cables. He kept records. He gave them to her father. Then Jacob disappeared. I was accused, and her father stayed silent. The rage that filled me was cold and hard as the iron I used to forge. He knew, I said. Edwin Harrison knew I was innocent, and he chose silence to protect his investigation. He let me suffer exile for 10 years because of the greater good. Rose's voice was soft. I am sorry. My father said he would clear your name when he had enough evidence, but he died before he could. I did not answer right away. I stood at the window, looking out toward the pines where I had buried my dream of returning to normal life. You were the best blacksmith this town ever had, Rose said. I nodded. You could return. No, I said. That man is dead. I am just the shadow left behind. She did not argue. She just sat there sharing the silence. It was a gift I had not known I needed. Smoke began to rise from below the mountain, not a forest fire. A deliberate burn, on the south slope where the wind would push flames upward. They are forcing us to move, Rose said. No, I answered. They are forcing us to die. I told her about the old tunnel. Miners used it years ago. It ran through the mountain and came out behind an abandoned warehouse at the edge of town. But she would have to trust me completely. Why should I trust a man the entire town calls a killer? She asked. I looked straight into her eyes. Because I am the only one who cares more about truth than survival. The tunnel entrance was hidden behind a rockfall that looked natural but was not. I had placed those stones myself years ago when this darkness was my first home after exile. The passage was narrow, damp, smelling of old metal and earth. Water dripped from somewhere deep inside, each drop echoing like a slow clock counting down to something. Outside, through the gaps in the rocks, I saw the sky turning gray, not just smoke. Snow clouds, winter coming 3 weeks early. This tunnel was dug in 1872, I told Rose as we moved through the darkness, my oil lamp casting dancing shadows on the wet stone walls. When the old mine collapsed, they abandoned it. But it still goes through the mountain, coming out behind the old warehouse on the town's edge. If we are fast, we can get there before snow closes the passes. "Why do you know this tunnel so well?" Rose asked. "Because I lived here for 3 months, before I built the cabin." The memory came unbidden. Me, 10 years younger, bruised, my clothes torn, hiding in this tunnel like an animal, eating roots, drinking standing water, deciding whether to die like a beast or live like a man, even if that man had to be alone. Deep in the tunnel, we found a room that had been widened by hand. Inside were wooden crates not covered in thick dust, new rope, an oil lamp that still smelled of fresh oil. "Someone is still using this place," I said. We opened the crates. Inside were papers, land purchase contracts, mine labor agreements, forged signatures, skillfully done, copies of official contracts versus hidden originals, and one envelope, separate from the rest, marked E.H. Private. Rose opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a letter, handwritten in feminine script, the paper yellowed with age. "Edwin, if you are reading this, I am dead. Caleb knows I was investigating him, but more important, Jacob is still alive. I saw him in the old tunnel, being kept as a laborer. They did not kill him because he knows blasting techniques too well. Save him. And if you can, forgive me for not being braver. Margaret." Tears ran down Rose's face. "Margaret was my mother. She died when I was 15. They said it was lung disease, but she wrote this before she died. She knew." The truth assembled itself like pieces of a puzzle I had been trying to solve for a decade. Margaret Harrison had worked as an accountant for the mine. She discovered the fraudulent books and documented them. Jacob, 16 years old, helped her. He was caught. Margaret was slowly poisoned with arsenic in her tea, dying over 6 months. Edwin Harrison learned the truth too late and tried to investigate, but Harrow arranged an accident. "Jacob is not dead," I said slowly, the realization hitting me like cold water. "They kept him alive, which means—" Rose finished the thought. "He is still somewhere, underground, for 10 years. I knelt, my hands shaking, not from fear, from rage. 10 years. I lived on this mountain thinking the boy was dead, while he was held in darkness, thinking no one would come. Rose put her hand on my shoulder. "We will find him." I looked at her. "How do you know I will not just run? Because you kept a child's coat for 10 years. You are not someone who gives up." A sound came from deeper in the tunnel, not from behind us, from ahead. Footsteps, light, not heavy boots, something softer. I drew my knife. Rose held the lamp high. A young woman emerged from the darkness, maybe 19 years old, red hair matted with soot, thin from malnutrition. Moira Brennan. She worked as a maid in Harrow's mansion. She carried a small cloth bag, trembling. "I knew you would come here, Mr. Dalton," Moira said, her voice shaking. "I heard the mayor on the telephone. He said if Dalton enters the tunnel, seal both ends. I had to warn you." I was suspicious. "Why help me? You work for Harrow." "Not by choice." She opened the cloth bag. Inside was a small brass bell with the initials J.T. carved on it, a piece of cloth with dried blood, a silver necklace with an angel pendant. Moira's voice broke. "Jacob is my brother, my half-brother, different mothers. When he disappeared, I was 9. I asked for work with Harrow to find him, and I did." She told us that Jacob was being held in the old copper mine north of town. The tunnel entrance was sealed with chains and a lock. Harrow went down occasionally, forcing Jacob to blast rock to expand a secret tunnel. They planned to use that tunnel to smuggle ore across the border without paying tariffs. "Why does he not scream?" Rose asked. "Would no one hear?" Moira's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "The mine is 4 miles from town, and they cut his vocal cords. He cannot speak. I stood. The blood in my veins turned to something cold and hard, like the iron I used to forge. "Take us there," I said. Moira shook her head. "We cannot. The snow is coming. If we go out now—" I cut her off. "That boy has lived underground for 10 years. I will not let him die there just because of weather." We made a plan, split into 2 groups. Moira would take Rose to the warehouse, find the deputy marshal. I would go alone to the old mine and find Jacob. Rose objected. "You cannot go alone." "I have been alone for 10 years, I said. "One more night makes no difference." Snow began to fall as we left the tunnel, large, heavy flakes that meant the storm would be bad. The old mine was on the north slope where sunlight never reached. The tunnel entrance was covered with wooden boards, rusted chains, and a lock the size of a fist. Snow was already piling on the rubble. Without Moira's directions, I would never have found it. I used a hammer and chisel from my tool bag. The lock was old and rusted but solid. It took 20 minutes. My hands went numb with cold. Finally, the chain fell away. I entered the tunnel. Total darkness. The smell of mold, rat droppings, and something else. The smell of a human living in despair. I lit my oil lamp. The flickering light revealed old rail tracks, rotted timber supports. "Jacob!" I called. The echo came back to me. No voice answered, but there was sound, the clink of metal chains against stone, from deep inside. I moved deeper. The tunnel opened into a small room that had been carved out by hand. A man sat against the wall, gaunt, long matted hair, thick beard, Jacob Thorne. Now 26 years old, but looking 50. His ankle was chained to an iron post driven into the rock. His eyes went wide when he saw the lamplight. I had prepared myself for something terrible, but nothing prepares you for seeing a boy you taught become a living ghost. Jacob could not speak. He pointed to his throat and shook his head. Then he wrote in the dust, "Mr. Dalton?" I knelt, fighting tears. "Jacob, I am here. I am sorry it took 10 years. He shook his head violently. He wrote, "Not your fault. They said you were dead too. I used my chisel and hammer on the chains." The chain was old, but the lock had been replaced recently. 15 minutes. My hands bled. Finally, the chain broke free. Jacob tried to stand. His legs shook, weak from years of little movement. I supported him. He grabbed me and wept without sound. We stood there in the darkness, in the abandoned mine. A man who lost 10 years of life. A boy who lost 10 years of youth. I did not say everything would be okay, because it would not be. Some things never heal completely. But I said, "You are not alone anymore." And that was the only truth I had to give. Jacob pulled away slightly and fumbled for something in the corner of the room, a piece of charcoal. He wrote on the wall, the letters shaky but clear. "There is a boy, Thomas, Harrow's stable boy. He is your nephew, your brother's son." The words hit me like a physical blow. My brother Samuel Dalton disappeared 12 years ago searching for gold in Montana. They said he died in a robbery. I never knew he had a child. Jacob wrote more. Samuel found out about mine fraud. Harrow killed him. Took Thomas, then 5 years old. Raised him as an orphan stable boy. Thomas does not know who he is. "You are certain?" I asked. Jacob nodded and wrote again. "Thomas has same scar on left wrist, same eyes." I watched him 7 years through cracks, never could call out. My purpose crystallized in that moment like ice forming on still water. I came to this mountain thinking I had lost everything. It turned out I still had a nephew, living under the roof of the man who killed his father, not knowing who he was. "We are leaving here," I said. "We find Thomas. We end this." We made it out of the mine into a world turned white. The snow was now a blizzard. Wind strong enough that I could barely stand. Jacob was weak, unable to walk far. The temperature had dropped well below freezing. We could not make it back to town. We would die halfway. I remembered an abandoned trapper's cabin a mile east. We fought through the snow. Jacob fell 3 times. I carried him up. The cabin was small and freezing, but it had walls and a roof. I built a fire in the stone hearth. gave Jacob warm water melted from snow. He shivered uncontrollably, not just from cold, but because this was the first time in 10 years he had seen the sky. Through the window, I could see faint lights from the town in the distance. I wondered if Rose was safe, if Moira had been discovered. Jacob rode in the dust near the fire. What now? Now, I said, we wait for the storm to pass. Then we fight. The snow buried the cabin up to the windows. In the town below, Rose and Moira huddled in the abandoned warehouse. They had made it out of the tunnel safely, but the blizzard trapped them as completely as it trapped me and Jacob. Rose stared out through a crack in the warehouse wall at the snow-covered street. She had entrusted her life to a man she met only hours ago, a man the entire town called a monster. But his eyes were not the eyes of a killer. They were the eyes of someone who had died once and was learning to live again. Moira sat nearby, pulling her thin shawl tighter. "Miss Harrison, I have to tell you the truth. I am not just helping because of Jacob. I am helping because Mayor Harrow is my father." Rose turned, shocked. "What?" Moira told her story in a flat voice, as if reading someone else's tragedy. Her mother, Alice Brennan, worked as a maid for the Harrow family 20 years ago. She became pregnant. Harrow would not acknowledge the child. Alice was arrested on false theft charges and gave birth to Moira in jail. She died when Moira was 3. Moira grew up in an orphanage. When Moira turned 15, Harrow hired her as a maid, not from kindness, but to watch her, to make sure she never told the truth. "I do not need him to claim me," Moira said. "I just need him to pay." Rose took Moira's hand. 2 young women, both lost parents to corruption, both forced to grow up with nameless pain. "We will end this," Rose said. "Together." For the first time in her life, Moira felt she was not alone. The next morning, when the worst of the storm had passed, a figure appeared at the warehouse door. Deputy Garrett Cole, 34 years old, his badge catching the weak sunlight. "Miss Harrison, Moira, I know you are here, and I know Nathaniel Dalton went to the old mine." Rose tensed. "Are you here to arrest us?" Garrett shook his head. "No, I am here to help you, because I am Nathaniel's brother." The revelation hung in the cold air like a held breath. Garrett told them his real name was Garrett Dalton. He was Nate's younger brother, 3 years apart. 12 years ago, when their oldest brother Samuel disappeared, Nate went searching and left Garrett with a guardian. 10 years ago, when Nate was accused, Harrow came to Garrett, then 24. "Your brother is a killer," Harrow had said, "but you could become a lawman, erase the Dalton shame." Garrett had been weak. He changed his name to Cole. He worked for Harrow. And he let Nate live alone on the mountain for 10 years, thinking his entire family had turned their backs. "But I never believed he was a killer," Garrett said. "I was just too much of a coward to do anything." "Why help now?" Rose asked. 3 days ago, Harrow ordered me to burn the cabin on the mountain. He said if Dalton and Harrison's daughter died in the fire, it would be an accident. I would be promoted to sheriff. That is when I realized I could keep living safely, or I could finally become the brother I should have been. They made a plan. Garrett had keys to Harrow's office. He would retrieve the original ledgers from Harrow's safe. Rose and Moira would find Thomas and take him somewhere safe. When Nate and Jacob returned, they would confront Harrow publicly. They found Thomas in Harrow's stable. 17 years old now, light brown hair, blue eyes so much like Nate's, it was startling. A long scar on his left wrist, quiet, intelligent, always observing. Rose and Moira approached carefully. Thomas came out to meet them, polite but wary. "Thomas, do you remember anything from when you were 5 years old?" Moira asked. Thomas stopped. "Why do you ask?" "Because you are not an orphan. You had a father. You have an uncle, and they did not abandon you." Thomas stepped back, shaking his head. "I do not understand." Rose showed him an old photograph from Moira's bag. 3 brothers standing in front of an old blacksmith shop. Samuel Dalton, Nathaniel Dalton, young Garrett. Thomas held the photo with shaking hands. "I used to dream about this man," he said, pointing to Samuel. "He taught me to play the whistle." But the mayor said it was just my imagination. Not imagination, Moira said. You are Thomas Dalton. Your father was Samuel. He was killed by Harrow. Harrow kept you as a hostage to make sure Nathaniel never came back to town. And Thomas sank down onto a hay bale. He wept, not from sadness, but from relief. I always felt like I did not belong here, like I was living someone else's life. They decided to take Thomas to the church, neutral ground. But as they stepped out of the stable, Caleb Harrow stood there with 6 armed men. Miss Harrison, Moira, and dear Thomas, I think we should talk. The storm had passed, but another storm was just beginning. The stable yard felt suddenly smaller, the air thinner. Harrow stood with the confidence of a man who had never truly been challenged. His 6 men formed a loose semicircle, rifles held casually but ready. The mayor's silver hair caught the weak sunlight filtering through breaking clouds. He wore his 3-piece suit even in the cold, as if formality could armor him against the truth. Rose stepped forward, placing herself between Harrow and Thomas. Her hips still ached from yesterday's fall, but she refused to show weakness. Mayor Harrow, she said, her voice steady, we were just taking Thomas to the church. He is not feeling well. Harrow smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. Miss Harrison, I am disappointed. Your father and I were friends. He understood that to build something, sometimes sacrifices must be made. Sacrifices? Rose's voice cut sharp as winter wind. You call murdering 14 people a sacrifice? Imprisoning a boy for 10 years a sacrifice? Harrow did not deny it. He simply adjusted his vest, a small gesture that somehow made him seem more dangerous, not less. That copper mine feeds this entire town, Miss Harrison, but to keep it profitable, we had to reduce costs. Safety measures are expensive. I gave them a choice. Let 14 people die, or let 300 people starve. What would you have chosen? The logic was monstrous in its simplicity. Moira's hands clenched into fists. Thomas stood frozen, trying to process that the man who raised him was calmly discussing murder as mathematics. You are not the man making hard choices, Rose said. You are the man who chose power over people. Harrow's smile faded. Power and responsibility, Miss Harrison, they always come together, and now I must fulfill my final responsibility. He raised his hand, signaling his men to move forward, but then a voice came from the stable entrance, deep, calm, dangerous. Put your hand down, Caleb. Nathaniel Dalton stepped into view, Jacob beside him, supported but standing. Deputy Garrett emerged from the shadows behind them, his pistol drawn but aimed at the ground, not yet choosing sides publicly. Jacob looked like something pulled from a grave, gaunt, hair long and matted despite attempts to clean it. But his eyes were alive, alert, and filled with something harder than hate. Recognition, justice. Harrow did not look surprised. If anything, he seemed almost relieved. Nathaniel, it has been a long time. Not long enough, I answered. We stood there in the stable yard, 2 men who had once known each other, separated by a decade and an ocean of lies. The 6 armed men shifted uncomfortably. This was not supposed to happen. Nathaniel Dalton was supposed to be on the mountain, trapped by snow or smoke or fear, not here, not with the boy everyone thought was dead. You kept him alive, I said, looking at Jacob. My apprentice, the boy I taught to shape iron, to read heat and metal, to understand that strength comes from patience, not force. Of course I did, Harrow replied. Jacob knows blasting techniques better than any man in the territory. I needed him. Just as I needed you gone, Nathaniel. You were too rigid. You would have destroyed everything I built. You built nothing, I said. You stole. You murdered. You called it progress. Harrow's expression shifted then, showing something raw beneath the polished surface. I saved this town. When the old mine was failing, I found investors. I secured contracts. Yes, corners were cut. Yes, people died. But more lived. That is leadership, Nathaniel, making choices you cannot afford to make. I stepped closer to Thomas. The boy, now 17, looked at me with eyes so much like Samuel's that it hurt to breathe. My brother's son, raised by the man who killed my brother. "Thomas," I said quietly, "you are Thomas Dalton. Your father was my brother Samuel. He loved you more than anything in this world, and this man killed him because your father dared to tell the truth." Thomas looked between us, his world cracking open. "You raised me," he said to Harrow, voice breaking. "You taught me to ride horses. You gave me a place to live. Why?" For the first time, Harrow's composure slipped. Just for a moment, something almost human crossed his face. "Because I am not a monster, Thomas. I kept you alive because you reminded me that some things are still worth protecting." The admission hung in the cold air like a confession. Rose spoke, her voice cutting through the tension. "You do not get to claim goodness for keeping alive the child of a man you murdered." Harrow turned to her, and for a moment I saw genuine pain in his eyes. "Your mother understood, Miss Harrison. Margaret knew what I was doing. She tried to stop me, yes. But she also knew why I did it. This town was dying. The mine was our only hope." "My mother died trying to expose you," Rose said. "Do not pretend you were allies." "We were both trying to save people," Harrow said. "We simply disagreed on the cost." That was when Jacob moved. He had been silent, voiceless, for so long that everyone had almost forgotten he was there. He stepped forward and pulled a piece of charcoal from his pocket. On the stable wall he wrote in large, shaky letters, "You chose your comfort over our lives." The words hit harder than any shout could have. Here was a man who could not speak, who had lived in darkness for a decade, reducing Harrow's philosophy to its brutal truth. Harrow stared at the words. For a moment, just a moment, I thought he might break, might apologize, might show remorse. Instead, he drew a pistol from inside his coat. He did not aim it at me. He aimed it at Rose. "Miss Harrison is going to walk away from here," Harrow said. "You all are, because if you do not, if you force my hand, people will die, and their blood will be on your conscience, not mine." Garrett finally made his choice. He raised his pistol, aiming at Harrow. "Put the gun down, Mayor." Harrow looked at his deputy with something like disappointment. "Garrett, I gave you everything. A career, respect, a chance to escape your family's shame." "You gave me lies," Garrett said, "and I was weak enough to accept them. Not anymore." The tension stretched like a wire pulled too tight. 6 armed men, uncertain. Harrow with a gun on Rose. Garrett with a gun on Harrow. Me, Jacob, Moira, and Thomas caught in the middle of a standoff that could only end badly. Then the ground trembled. Not an earthquake. Something else. A low rumble from beneath our feet, like the mountain itself, was groaning. Jacob's eyes went wide. He grabbed the charcoal and wrote frantically, "Explosives. Tunnel. Harrow set timers." I looked at Harrow. "What did you do?" Harrow's expression was almost peaceful. "Insurance, Nathaniel. I placed dynamite in the main mine tunnel 3 days ago. If I do not disarm it within the hour, it will collapse. And when it does, it will take half the town with it." "You are insane," Rose breathed. "I am thorough," Harrow corrected. "If the truth comes out, this town will tear itself apart. People will demand justice. The mine will close. 300 people will lose their livelihoods. Better to end it quickly. Bury the evidence. Bury the pain. Let them start fresh." "You would kill innocent people to hide your crimes?" Garrett asked, his gun hand shaking. "I would spare them the agony of knowing how their prosperity was built," Harrow said. "Sometimes mercy looks like cruelty." Before anyone could react, Harrow moved. He kicked over a lantern hanging by the stable door. Oil spilled across the hay. Fire caught instantly, racing up the wooden wall. In the chaos, Harrow ran. He mounted a horse and rode toward the mine, his men scattering in confusion between fighting the fire and following their employer. I ran after him, not to stop him, but to help him. Because if that mine collapsed, dozens of miners were underground. Dozens of families would lose fathers and sons. "Garrett," I shouted, "get everyone away from the mine. Ring the warning bell." I did not wait to see if he obeyed. I just ran. Behind me, Rose's voice called out, but I could not stop. The mountain was about to judge us all, and I needed to reach the mine before judgment fell. The main mine entrance was a mile north of town. My legs burned as I ran through snow that had not yet melted. Harrow was ahead on horseback, but the deep drifts slowed even him. I knew shortcuts from my years on the mountain, narrow paths where a man on foot could move faster than a horse. I reached the mine entrance as Harrow was dismounting. The warning bell from town was already ringing, its frantic clanging echoing across the valley. Men were emerging from the mine, confused, frightened. A foreman was shouting orders. Harrow ignored them all. He ran into the mine tunnel. I followed. The darkness swallowed us. The mine tunnels were lit by oil lamps every 50 feet, creating pools of light separated by shadows. The air smelled of rock dust, sweat, and something chemical. "Dynamite! Harrow!" I shouted. "Where is it?" He did not answer. He just kept running, deeper into the earth, down stone steps, through support timbers that creaked ominously. The rumbling grew louder. Small rocks fell from the ceiling. We reached a junction where 3 tunnels met. Harrow paused, breathing hard, looking at each passage as if trying to remember. "Which way?" I demanded. "I do not remember," he said, and for the first time I heard fear in his voice, real fear. "I set them 3 days ago. I was angry. I was not thinking clearly. It could be any of these tunnels." I grabbed his shoulder and spun him around. "Then we search all 3. How much time?" He pulled out a pocket watch. 12 minutes. 12 minutes to search 3 tunnels. Impossible. But I had learned on the mountain that impossible just meant you had not thought hard enough yet. "The deepest tunnel," I said. "That is where you would hide it. Maximum damage if you wanted to collapse the mine." Harrow nodded slowly. "The western shaft. It goes down to the water table." We ran. The tunnel sloped sharply downward. Water pooled on the floor ice cold, soaking through our boots. The lamplight grew dimmer. The air grew thinner. At the bottom, in a chamber carved from solid rock, I saw them. 3 bundles of dynamite wired together, connected to a clockwork timer. The mechanism ticked with mechanical precision. 4 minutes left. I knelt beside the device. I had some experience with explosives from my time in the war years ago, but this was more sophisticated than anything I had worked with. Multiple wires, multiple charges, designed so that cutting the wrong wire would trigger an immediate explosion. Harrow knelt beside me. "I will do it. This is my responsibility." "You do not know which wire," I said. "Neither do you." He was right, but I had steadier hands. 10 years of living alone, of small, careful tasks, of patience learned from long winters and longer nights. "Let me," I said. I studied the mechanism. 3 wires, red, black, green. Standard colors, but arranged in a pattern that suggested a man who knew what he was doing. Harrow had not just placed random explosives, he had built a trap. 3 minutes. "The green wire," Harrow said. "I think it is the green wire." "You think?" I was drunk when I set this up, angry, but I remember choosing green because it seemed safest, least likely to be cut by accident. 2 minutes. I looked at him. This man had destroyed my life, had killed my brother, had imprisoned Jacob, had poisoned Rose's mother, had built his power on corpses and lies. But he was also trying to disarm a bomb that would kill dozens of innocent miners. I reached for the green wire. "Wait," Harrow said. He grabbed my hand. "If you are wrong, we both die here. You should go. You have Thomas to care for, Jacob to help, Rose to whatever you need to do." "You are not getting out of justice that easily," I said. "This is not about justice," Harrow said quietly. "This is about the fact that I am tired, Nathaniel. Tired of being the villain. Tired of justifying. Tired of remembering their faces. If this goes wrong, maybe that is the judgment I deserve." 1 minute. "You do not get to choose your judgment," I said. "You face it. You live with it. You let the people you hurt decide what you deserve." I cut the green wire. For a moment, nothing happened. The ticking continued. My heart stopped. Then the mechanism went silent. The timer froze at 42 seconds. We sat there in the darkness, in the depths of the earth, two men who had been enemies, breathing hard, alive. Harrow laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was the laugh of a man who had gambled everything and lost. "Why did you save me?" he asked. "You could have let me die down here, told everyone I set the explosives, and you tried to stop me. Because if you die, the truth dies with you, and the people you killed deserve to be remembered, not buried in another lie." We climbed back up through the mine. Men were waiting at the entrance, anxious, the foreman demanding to know what happened. Garrett was there, gun still drawn. Rose stood beside him, limping but determined. Jacob leaned against a support beam, exhausted. Moira held Thomas, who looked lost. Harrow emerged into the daylight and raised his hands. "I surrender to Deputy Dalton, to federal authority, to whatever justice you see fit." The foreman stared. "Mayor Harrow, what is this about?" "It is about the truth," Harrow said, "and I am done running from it." Garrett stepped forward and placed iron cuffs on Harrow's wrists. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it just felt heavy. Rose came to me. She did not say anything. Just stood beside me, close enough that I could feel her warmth in the cold air. Jacob wrote on a scrap of paper someone handed him. "Is it over?" "No," I said, "but it is beginning to end." They held Harrow in the sheriff's office overnight. Garrett stayed guard. By morning, a federal marshal had arrived, summoned by Garrett's telegraph the day before. Deputy Marshal Reeves, a tall man with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He interviewed each of us separately. Rose told him about her mother's death, about the forged land contracts. Moira told him about Jacob's imprisonment, about being Harrow's unacknowledged daughter. Jacob wrote his testimony in careful script, his hand shaking from years of disuse. When Reeves interviewed me, he asked one simple question. "Why did you wait 10 years to come forward?" "Because I had no proof," I said. "Just my word against a mayor's, and this town made it clear whose word they valued." "And now?" "Now I have witnesses, documents, and a town that cannot look away." By afternoon, the marshal had seen enough. He ordered Harrow transported to the territorial capital for trial. But first, he did something unexpected. He called a town meeting in the square. Everyone came, miners and merchants, farmers and blacksmiths, women carrying children, old men leaning on canes. The entire population of Coldwater gathered in the cold autumn sunlight to hear what their mayor had done. Marshal Reeves stood on the courthouse steps. Harrow stood beside him, hands cuffed. I stood with Rose, Jacob, Moira, Thomas, and Garrett. Reeves read the charges in a voice that carried across the square. 14 counts of negligent homicide, 1 count of unlawful imprisonment, 1 count of murder in the first degree for Samuel Dalton, multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. The crowd murmured, some in disbelief, some in anger, some in shame. Then Reeves did something else. He asked me to speak. I stepped forward. A decade ago I had stood in this same square while men threw stones and shouted "murderer." Now they stood silent, waiting. "I do not need you to believe me," I said. "I need you to believe the evidence. I need you to remember the people who died." I pulled out the ledger. The one Jacob had kept, the one Rose's mother had added to. I read the names, all 14. Not just names, stories. Michael O'Brien, 34 years old, 3 children. Died when a support cable snapped. The cable had been cut halfway through to save money on replacements. Sarah Kimball, 22 years old, married 6 months, died in a tunnel collapse. The supports were substandard, purchased from a supplier who gave kickbacks to Mayor Harrow. I read all 14 names, told all 14 stories. By the time I finished, several people in the crowd were weeping. An old man stepped forward from the crowd. I recognized him. He had thrown one of the stones 10 years ago. He took off his hat and placed it over his heart. Then he knelt. One by one, others followed. Not everyone, but enough. They knelt not to me, but to the memory of the people they had forgotten, the people whose deaths they had accepted as the cost of prosperity. It was the most profound silence I had ever heard. Harrow watched this from the courthouse steps. When Marshal Reeves asked if he had anything to say, Harrow looked out at his town, at Moira, standing with her arms wrapped around herself, at Thomas, the boy he had raised on lies. "I am not asking for forgiveness," Harrow said. "I am asking you to understand. Every decision I made for this town, to keep the mine open, to keep families fed. I chose the few over the many. I chose survival over safety. I do not regret the choices. I regret that they were necessary." "They were not necessary," Rose said, stepping forward. "They were convenient. You chose profit over people and called it leadership." Harrow looked at her with something that might have been respect. "You are braver than your mother, Miss Harrison. She understood the cost but could not bear to see it paid. You understand it and refuse to accept it. Perhaps that is the difference between your generation and mine." Marshal Reeves cleared his throat. "Caleb Harrow, you will be transported to the territorial capital to stand trial. Does anyone here have anything to add before we proceed?" Moira stepped forward. The crowd parted for her. She walked up the courthouse steps until she stood directly in front of Harrow. "You are my father," she said quietly, but her voice carried in the silence. "You never claimed me, never acknowledged me. I grew up thinking I was worthless, that I was a mistake." Harrow's face showed pain, real pain. "Moira, I did not acknowledge you because this town would have destroyed you. They would have called you shameful names, treated you as less than. I thought silence was protection." "You thought silence was easier," Moira said. "But I will tell you something. I am not asking for your love. I am not asking for your name. I am asking you to know that I survived despite you, that I found family in people who were not blood, and that I am not your daughter anymore. I am Moira Brennan, and that is enough." She turned and walked back to stand with Rose, with Jacob, with me. Harrow watched her go, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw tears on his face. The marshal led Harrow away. The crowd began to disperse, talking in low voices, processing what they had learned. Some people approached me to apologize. I accepted their words but did not embrace them. Forgiveness would take time. Trust would take longer. Thomas came to me as the square emptied. My nephew, Samuel's son. He looked so much like my brother that it hurt. "I do not know what to call you," he said. "Nathaniel is fine. Or Nate. Whatever feels right." Did my father really die trying to expose Harrow? Yes. Your father was the bravest man I knew. He could have stayed silent, could have taken the bribes Harrow offered, but he chose truth even when it cost him everything. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Harrow told me my father abandoned me, left me because I was not good enough." The rage I felt then was cold and absolute. Your father loved you more than his own life, and Harrow knew that. That is why he kept you, not as kindness, as leverage, as insurance that I would never come back. Are you angry I believed him? No, you were 5 years old. Children believe what they are told. That is not weakness. That is trust, and trust is precious. Rose joined us. "The marshal wants to speak with you both, about testimony, about what happens next." As we walked toward the courthouse, Jacob caught my arm. He handed me a piece of paper. On it, he had written in careful letters, "Thank you for not forgetting me." I folded the paper and put it in my pocket. "I tried to find you. For years I searched. I am sorry it took so long." Jacob shook his head. He wrote quickly, "Not your fault. You came. That is what matters." Over the next week, things happened quickly. The federal investigation widened. They found documents in Harrow's office proving a network of corruption that stretched beyond Coldwater to 3 other mining towns, other mayors, other sheriffs, a system built on exploitation and maintained by silence. Garrett resigned as deputy and testified fully against Harrow. The town held a special election. They chose a new sheriff, a miner who had lost his brother in one of the collapses. Garrett decided to leave Coldwater, to start over somewhere. His name was not Dalton or Cole, but just a name. Before he left, he came to see me. We stood outside the cabin I was building on the edge of town, not on the mountain, not in exile, just on the edge, where I could see both the wilderness and the community. "I am sorry," Garrett said. "For 10 years, I let you carry this alone." "You were young," I said. "Harrow manipulated you." I was old enough to know better, old enough to choose courage. I chose comfort instead. "You chose differently when it mattered," I said. "That counts." He nodded. We shook hands, not as strangers, not quite as brothers yet, but as two men who understood that family was something you could lose and, with work, begin to rebuild. Rose used her inheritance to establish a school, not just for children, for everyone, reading, writing, accounting. She hired Moira as a teacher. Together, they created something Margaret Harrison had dreamed of: education as a path to power that did not require corruption. Jacob's vocal cords could not be fully repaired, but a doctor from Denver performed a surgery that allowed him to whisper. His first words, spoken in a voice like dry leaves, were "thank you." He became a clerk for the new mine administration, ensuring that safety records were kept accurately, that no more names would be added to the list of forgotten dead. Thomas stayed with me. We worked together in the blacksmith shop I reopened. I taught him the trade his father never got to teach him: how to read heat in metal, how to shape iron with patience, how to understand that strength comes not from force, but from knowing when to strike and when to let the metal cool. One evening as we worked, Thomas asked me about the child's coat that still hung in my old cabin on the mountain. Whose was it? I had known this question would come. I set down my hammer and looked at the fire in the forge. "It was yours, from when you were small. Samuel had it made for your 5th birthday. When you disappeared, I kept it. I told myself it was to remember him. But really, it was because I could not accept that you were gone, that I had failed to protect you." Thomas touched the scar on his wrist. "Harrow told me I got this falling from a wagon, but I remember different. I remember someone, a man, holding my hand too tight when I tried to run. Samuel fought to keep you. That scar is from when they took you from him." We stood in silence, the forge fire crackling, casting shadows on the walls. "I am angry," Thomas said finally. "At Harrow, at the town, at my father for dying, at you for not finding me sooner. I know it is not fair, but I am angry." "Anger is honest," I said. "It is what you do with it that matters." "What should I do with it?" "Build something, learn something, help someone. Turn the anger into something that would make your father proud." The trial took place in spring. I traveled to the territorial capital with Rose, Jacob, and Moira. We testified. We presented evidence. The defense argued that Harrow had acted in the best interests of economic development, that tragic accidents were unavoidable in mining. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. They found Harrow guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 20 years in territorial prison. Harrow stood as the sentence was read, his face impassive. When asked if he had final words, he looked at me. "Nathaniel Dalton, you won." The truth came out. Justice was served, but I wonder in 10 years, when the mine has closed because the new safety regulations make it unprofitable, when families are hungry, when the town is dying, will you still feel victorious? "I do not seek victory," I said. "I seek accountability. And yes, even if the cost is high, I will still believe it was worth it, because a prosperity built on corpses is no prosperity at all." The judge gavelled the proceedings closed. We left the courthouse into bright spring sunshine. On the journey home, Rose sat beside me in the wagon. "What will you do now?" she asked. "Live," I said. "Teach Thomas, help Jacob recover. Maybe, if you are willing, spend time with someone who makes me remember what it feels like to hope." She smiled. It was the first time I had seen her truly smile since the day she fell from the cliff. I think I would like that. We returned to Coldwater as the season turned. The mine did not close. The new regulations made it less profitable, but still viable. More importantly, they made it safer. No more names added to the list of dead. The town erected a memorial in the square. 14 names carved in stone. Not hidden, not forgotten. A reminder that progress measured in bodies is no progress at all. I stood before that memorial one evening as the sun set. Rose joined me, then Jacob, then Moira, then Thomas. We stood together, this family built from loss and pain and the stubborn refusal to let lies stand. "They will remember," Rose said quietly. "Yes," I agreed. "They will remember." And for the first time in 10 years, I felt something I had almost forgotten. Not happiness, not yet, but the possibility of it. The knowledge that the mountain no longer owned me, that I could walk among people without shame, that my name, Nathaniel Dalton, meant something other than monster. It meant someone who survived, someone who fought, someone who refused to let the truth stay buried. And in the end, that was enough. The stable yard felt smaller than it was. 6 armed men formed a loose semicircle around us, their rifles not quite raised, but ready. The morning sun broke through the last of the storm clouds, casting long shadows across the trampled snow. Caleb Harrow stood at the center, wearing his tailored wool coat and polished boots, looking more like a banker than a man who had orchestrated murders for a decade. Rose stepped forward, placing herself between Harrow and Thomas. She did not reach for a weapon. She did not need to. Her presence alone was defiance. "Miss Harrison," Harrow said, his voice carrying that same smooth tone he used in town council meetings. "I am deeply disappointed. Your father and I were friends. He understood that to build something, sometimes sacrifices must be made." "Sacrifices?" Rose's voice cut through the cold air like a blade. "You call murdering 14 people sacrifices? You call imprisoning a boy for 10 years sacrifice?" Harrow did not deny it. That silence was worse than any confession. He simply adjusted his gloves, looking at each of us in turn. His eyes lingered on Moira, and something flickered there. Not quite regret. Something harder to name. "That copper mine feeds this entire town," Harrow said. "But to make it profitable, we had to reduce costs. Safety measures are expensive, Miss Harrison. I gave people a choice. Let 14 die, or let 300 starve when the mine closes." I felt Moira tense beside me. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear, from the effort of not screaming. Harrow continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a sermon. "I am not the monster you think I am. I am a man who had to make impossible decisions. My wife died giving birth to Moira. I could not acknowledge her publicly because society would destroy her. Better to let her think herself an orphan than a bastard." He turned to Moira directly for the first time. "Better to give you a quiet life than to paint you with shame." Moira's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but it carried. "You did not protect me. You abandoned me. There is a difference." "Is there?" Harrow's eyes were cold now. "I gave you work, a roof, food, more than most orphans receive." "You gave me scraps from the table of my birthright," Moira said, "and called it kindness." Thomas had been silent until now, watching this exchange like someone trying to understand a foreign language. But now he stepped forward, his young face confused and angry. "You raised me," Thomas said to Harrow. "You taught me to ride. You gave me a place to live. Why?" Harrow looked at Thomas, and for just a moment something genuine crossed his face. It might have been affection. It might have been guilt. The two can look similar. "Because I am not a monster, Thomas. I kept you alive when I could have quietly disposed of you. I kept you fed and safe. And your father, Samuel Dalton, he was going to destroy everything I built. He found out about the mine accidents and threatened to expose me. I had no choice but to remove him. But you were innocent. You reminded me that some things are still worth protecting." Rose's voice was steady as iron. "You did not save the town. You saved your power." Harrow's smile was sad. "Power and responsibility, Miss Harrison. They always walk together, and now I must exercise my final responsibility." He raised his hand, and the men lifted their rifles. That was when I heard it. A voice from the stable entrance, deep, calm, dangerous. "Put the guns down, Caleb." Nathaniel Dalton stepped into the yard, and the world seemed to shift on its axis. Jacob stood beside him, thin and unsteady, but upright. and behind them, Deputy Garrett Cole, his own rifle aimed squarely at Harrow's chest. Nate looked different than I remembered from our brief time together. His eyes held something harder now, something final. He had gone into that mine to rescue a broken boy and had come out with a purpose that burned like cold fire. Harrow did not look surprised. He did not even look worried. "Nathaniel, it has been a long time." "Not long enough," Nate said. The two men stared at each other across the snow-covered yard. 10 years of history compressed into that single moment. Nate took 3 slow steps forward, his boots crunching in the ice. 10 years ago, you accused me of murder," Nate said. "I believed you must have had evidence, but there was no evidence, only lies." "I did what was necessary," Harrow replied. "You were too rigid, Nathaniel. You would have torn apart everything I was building." Nate moved toward Thomas. The boy stood frozen, staring at the man who was his uncle, seeing his father's eyes looking back at him. "This is Thomas Dalton," Nate said quietly, but his voice carried to every person in that yard. "His father was my brother Samuel. Samuel loved him more than anything in this world, and he was murdered by this man for daring to tell the truth." Thomas looked at Harrow, his expression breaking. "You killed my father? And then you raised me? Why?" Harrow's composure cracked for the first time. His voice grew rough. "Because I am not a monster, boy. I killed Samuel because he gave me no choice, but I kept you alive because you reminded me that not everything has to die for progress." "You kept him as insurance," Nate said. "As long as you had Thomas, you knew I would never come back, a nephew I never knew I had, living under your roof as a hostage." Harrow shook his head slowly. "I am tired, Nathaniel. Tired of pretending I was right. Tired of seeing their faces in my dreams every night. I do not apologize for what I did, but I apologize for not having the courage to stop." He lowered his hand. The men with rifles hesitated, confused. Garrett kept his weapon steady. Then the ground shook. It was not an earthquake. It was deeper than that. A rumbling that came from beneath the town itself. Jacob grabbed a piece of charcoal from his pocket and wrote frantically on the stable wall, "Explosives. Harrow set timers. Tunnel will collapse." Harrow closed his eyes and nodded. "If I cannot control this, no one will. I set charges in the main mine. It will collapse in 10 minutes. It will take half the town with it." Garrett's face went white. "Why?" "Because if the truth comes out, this town will tear itself apart," Harrow said. "Better to let it die quickly." "We have to evacuate," Garrett shouted. But Harrow was already running. He vaulted onto a horse and galloped toward the mine entrance. "I will stop it. I have to stop it." Nate did not hesitate. He grabbed another horse and followed. Not to stop Harrow, to help him. "Garrett, get everyone out of the buildings near the mine." I watched Nate disappear down the road, chasing a man who had destroyed his life, riding to save a town that had exiled him. It made no sense. It made perfect sense. Garrett began shouting orders, directing people to evacuate. The church bell began ringing the alarm. People poured out of houses, confused and frightened. Moira grabbed my arm. "We have to help." We ran through the streets, knocking on doors, pulling people from their homes. Thomas ran with us, his young legs faster than ours. "Move, the mine is collapsing." The rumbling grew louder. Harrow and Nate reached the mine entrance together. The wooden support beams were already shaking, dust falling like deadly snow. They dismounted and ran inside, into the darkness where death was waiting with a ticking clock. The tunnel walls shook with every step. Dust choked the air, making each breath a fight. Harrow led the way, his lamp swinging wildly. We descended deeper, past the old work areas, down to the lowest level where he had hidden the contraband ore. 3 minutes, Harrow gasped. "The charges are in the deepest chamber." We ran. The tunnel seemed to stretch forever. I could hear the groan of stressed timbers above us, the crack of stone beginning to fracture. We burst into the final chamber. 3 bundles of dynamite sat against the far wall, wicks burning down to nothing. 2 minutes left, maybe less. Harrow fell to his knees beside the charges. his hands shaking as he tried to disconnect the wires. "The connections are too tight. I cannot—" I pushed him aside. My hands, calloused from 10 years of working metal and wood, moved with practiced precision. I had spent a lifetime understanding how things were built. That meant I understood how they came apart. One wire disconnected. Then another. 1 minute left. The third wire was stuck, wedged beneath a rock that had fallen. I pulled my knife and began cutting. "Run, Nathaniel," Harrow said quietly. "You have a nephew who needs you, and you have a daughter who needs a father," I replied, sawing at the wire. Harrow stared at me. "Moira will never forgive me." "That is not your decision to make. It is hers." 30 seconds. The wire snapped free. I grabbed the fuse and ripped it from the dynamite with 10 seconds to spare. The burning end fell to the stone floor, hissing as it died. We sat there in the darkness, breathing hard, surrounded by tons of rock that had almost become our grave. "Why did you save me?" Harrow asked. I stood and offered him my hand. "Because if you die, the truth dies with you, and the people you killed will never be remembered." Harrow took my hand and pulled himself up. We walked out of that mine together, the mountain groaning around us but holding. When we emerged into daylight, the entire town had gathered in the square. 300 faces turned to watch us. Deputy Marshal Reeves had arrived from Denver, summoned by Garrett's telegram. He stood with Garrett, holding the ledgers that had been recovered from Harrow's safe. Caleb Harrow walked forward into the center of the square and held out his wrists. "I am ready," he said. 1 week later, the town square looked different in the pale autumn sunlight. A platform had been erected, but not for a hanging, for a trial. The territorial judge had come from the capital, a severe woman named Catherine Walsh, who believed in public justice. Harrow stood before the crowd, his hands bound. The charges were read aloud. 14 counts of negligent homicide, 1 count of unlawful imprisonment, 1 count of murder in the first degree, multiple counts of fraud. The townspeople watched in silence. Some faces showed anger, some showed shame. A few still showed doubt. Judge Walsh asked if Harrow wished to speak. He did. "I will not beg forgiveness," Harrow began. "I will not claim I was misunderstood. What I did with full knowledge. 14 people died because I valued profit over safety. Jacob Thorne lost 10 years of his life because I needed his skills and his silence. Nathaniel Dalton died because he would not compromise with corruption." He paused, looking out over the crowd. His eyes found Moira. "But I want my daughter to know something. Moira, you were not a mistake. I was. I was too cowardly to love you openly. I told myself I was protecting you from society's judgment. The truth is, I was protecting myself from my own shame. You deserved better than I gave you." Moira stood with Rose, her face unreadable. Tears ran down her cheeks, but she did not look away. Harrow continued, "I kept Thomas Dalton alive not as insurance, but because looking at him reminded me that innocence still existed, that not everything had to be corrupted by my choices. It was a small mercy in a sea of cruelty, but it was real." Judge Walsh interrupted. "Mercy does not erase murder, Mr. Harrow." "I know," Harrow said. "I am not asking for pardon. I am asking that when you remember me, you remember both what I destroyed and what I tried, however poorly, to preserve." The verdict came swiftly. Guilty on all counts. Harrow would be transported to the territorial prison to await sentencing. Life imprisonment or hanging to be determined. As the marshal's men led Harrow away, Moira stepped forward. Everyone expected her to spit at him or curse him. Instead, she spoke quietly, her voice carrying in the stillness. "I will not forgive you, but I will remember you, not as a killer, but as a man who could have been better and chose not to be." She turned and walked away. It was the best goodbye she could give. I stood at the edge of the crowd watching. Thomas stood beside me, tall and quiet. In the past week I had told him stories about his father, about Samuel's laugh, about how he played the whistle, about the day Samuel held newborn Thomas and cried with joy. Did he really love me? Thomas asked. More than his own life, I answered. Judge Walsh called for order. There is one more matter to address. Nathaniel Dalton, please step forward. I walked into the center of the square, the same square where, in another timeline, I would have hung. The faces that watched me now were different. Some held respect, some held guilt. A few still held suspicion. Dr. Harriet Chen, who had traveled from Denver to treat Jacob's injuries, stood beside the judge. She held a wooden box. Mr. Dalton, Judge Walsh said, 10 years ago you were falsely accused and driven from this town. No trial was held. No evidence was presented. An innocent man was punished because it was convenient for those in power. She opened the box. Inside was a sheriff's badge, not just any badge, the one that had belonged to my brother Samuel. This badge was found in Caleb Harrow's personal safe, along with 6 others belonging to men who opposed him and disappeared. Your brother was murdered for trying to uphold the law. In his memory, and in recognition of the injustice done to you, the territorial governor has appointed you as the new sheriff of Coldwater. The crowd murmured, some in approval, some in shock. I stared at the badge. 10 years ago, I would have taken it with pride. Now, it felt like a chain. I cannot, I said. Judge Walsh raised an eyebrow. Cannot or will not? I am not the man I was 10 years ago, I said. The town needs someone who still believes in it. I am not sure I do. It was Thomas who spoke next, his young voice clear. Then, let me believe for both of us. I looked at him. This boy, this young man, who had every reason to hate this town, was asking me to stay. You taught my father to be a blacksmith, Thomas said. He taught me, through memories I barely have, to be brave. Now teach me to be both. Stay. Not for them. For us. I picked up the badge. It was heavier than I remembered. I pinned it to my chest. I will serve for 1 year, I said, and then the town will choose its own sheriff, someone who was not broken by this place. Judge Walsh nodded. 1 year is enough to begin healing. The crowd dispersed slowly. Some people approached to shake my hand. Others walked away quickly, unable to meet my eyes. An old man named Samuel Pritchard, who had thrown stones at me 10 years ago, stopped in front of me. He removed his hat. Then he knelt in the dirt. I was wrong, he said simply, and I am sorry. One by one, others followed. Not all of them, but enough. Enough. They knelt in the town square, not to me, but to the memory of those who had died, to the 14 names in the ledger, to Samuel Dalton, to the 10 years Jacob lost, to the truth they had been too comfortable to seek. It was not forgiveness, it was acknowledgement. And that was a start. 6 months passed like water finding its level. Thomas stood at the forge, hammer in hand, shaping horseshoe iron with strokes that would have made his father proud. 6 months ago his hands shook when he held the tools. Now they moved with purpose. You are thinking too much, I told him. I am thinking about him, Thomas said. My father, whether he would be proud. He is. Thomas stopped hammering. How can you know? Because I see him in you, not in your face, in your choices. Samuel never took the easy path, neither do you. Thomas placed the horseshoe in the water bucket. Steam hissed. Do you still have nightmares? He asked. Every night? Do they get better? No, but I get stronger. Thomas nodded slowly. Uncle Nate, thank you for not giving up on me. I did not have a choice, I said. You are family. Family does not give up. We returned to work. The rhythm of hammer on anvil filled the shop. Outside, Coldwater went about its business. A town learning to live with truth instead of comfortable lies. It was not easy, but it was real, and real was enough. The copper mine was permanently closed, its tunnels sealed. A new mine opened 3 miles east, built with proper safety measures and fair wages. It was named the Kimball O'Brien Memorial Mine, after 2 of the 14 who had died. All profits were split evenly between the workers and the families of the victims. Rose Harrison used her inheritance to build a school on the edge of town. She named it the Margaret Harrison School for All, honoring the mother who had died seeking truth. The building was simple but sturdy, with large windows that let in light and books that anyone could borrow. Rose taught reading and writing 3 days a week, accepting no payment. I watched her sometimes from across the street, the way she moved among the children with patience and certainty. She had asked me once if I would court her properly. I told her I did not know if I remembered how. She said we could learn together. We were learning slowly, like two people who had forgotten the language of hope and were teaching it to each other one word at a time. Moira Brennan, who carried a name that was not quite hers and a father who would not claim her, found her own path. Garrett, now the permanent sheriff, offered her a place in his home, not as a servant, as a sister. She learned bookkeeping from Rose and began keeping the town's financial records. She was good at it. Numbers did not lie the way people did. On Sunday afternoons, Moira visited the territorial prison. She sat across from Caleb Harrow in the visiting room and said very little. Sometimes she told him about her week. Sometimes she just sat in silence. She did not forgive him, but she witnessed him. And somehow that mattered. Jacob Thorne underwent surgery in Denver, performed by Dr. Chen and a specialist from San Francisco. They could not fully restore his vocal cords, but they gave him back a whisper. It was enough. He worked as a clerk for the Territorial Marshal's office, documenting testimonies in his careful handwriting. His hands, which had been forced to blast rock in darkness, now recorded truth in daylight. Thomas lived with me in a new cabin built at the edge of town, close enough to be part of the community, but far enough that we could still see the mountain. I reopened my blacksmith shop, teaching Thomas the trade his father had learned. Every evening, Thomas played the whistle, the melodies coming back to him like memories surfacing from deep water. "Did my father play this song?" he would ask. "Yes," I would tell him. "He played it the night you were born." But it was the memorial that mattered most. 1 year to the day after Harrow's arrest, we gathered in the town square. A monument stood where the gallows had nearly claimed me. Not a statue of a hero, just a simple stone column with 14 names carved into it. Beneath each name was a line, not just their death dates, their lives. Michael O'Brien, 34, father of 3, loved fishing. Sarah Kimball, 22, newlywed, sang in the church choir. James Whitmore, 41, played violin, never missed his daughter's birthday. On and on. 14 people who had been reduced to accident statistics, now remembered as humans who had lived and loved and mattered. The entire town gathered. 300 people stood in silence as I read each name aloud. Not just the names, the stories. Rose had spent months interviewing families, collecting memories, ensuring that each person was more than a date on a ledger. When I finished reading, something unexpected happened. Samuel Pritchard, the old man who had knelt in apology months before, stepped forward. He carried a wooden box. "I was the foreman," he said, his voice shaking. "I knew the cables were fraying. I told Harrow. He said fixing them would cost too much. He said if I reported it, I would lose my job and my pension. I chose silence. I chose my comfort over their lives." He opened the box. Inside were 14 small river stones, each one painted with a name. "I have carried these for 10 years, Pritchard said. "Every night I take them out and say their names. I wanted to bring them here, to leave them, not to be forgiven, but to be witnessed." He placed the stones at the base of the monument and walked away. Others followed. A woman brought a pressed flower from her sister's funeral. A man brought a work glove that had belonged to his uncle. A child brought a drawing she had made of her grandfather. The memorial became more than stone. It became a place where grief was allowed to exist. Rose stood beside me, her hand finding mine. "This is what justice looks like," she said quietly. "Not revenge, memory." Judge Walsh, who had stayed in town to ensure the transition was stable, spoke to the crowd. "What happened here was not unique," she said. "Across this territory, In 100 towns just like this one, powerful men make decisions that cost lives. They tell themselves it is necessary. They tell themselves the greater good requires sacrifice, but the greater good never requires us to forget the names of those we sacrifice. Coldwater has chosen to remember. Let it be an example. As the crowd began to disperse, Thomas approached the monument. He placed his hand on his father's name, carved not among the 14 workers, but on a separate line. Samuel Dalton, murdered for seeking justice. "I wish I had known him," Thomas said. "You do know him," I replied. "Every time you stand up when it is easier to sit down. Every time you tell the truth when lies are safer. That is your father living through you." We walked home together through the spring evening, past the school where Rose taught, past the sheriff's office where Garrett worked late documenting the day's events, past the small house where Moira lived with a cat she had rescued, and books she was teaching herself to love. The mountain loomed in the distance, still imposing, still beautiful. I had spent 10 years on that mountain thinking it was my prison. I understood now it had been my preparation. You cannot lead people through darkness unless you have walked in it yourself. That night, sitting on the porch of our cabin, I told Thomas about his grandmother and grandfather, about the Dalton family before everything fell apart. I told him about Samuel's jokes and Garrett's childhood mischief, and the forge where we had all learned that iron becomes strongest when it is heated and hammered and shaped by forces that should break it. "Do you think you will ever stop being angry?" Thomas asked. I considered the question. "No, but I have learned that anger is not the opposite of peace. Bitterness is. Anger can drive you to change things. Bitterness just makes you cold." "Are you at peace?" "I am getting there," I said, "one day at a time." 3 days later, Garrett came to the blacksmith shop with a folder of documents. He looked troubled. "What is wrong?" I asked. "I received a report from the marshal's office in Silver Creek," Garrett said. 3 deaths in the past 6 months, all ruled accidents, all in mines, all with the same pattern as what happened here." He opened the folder. Inside were accident reports signed by officials, stamped with seals, and at the bottom of each report, in the section for investigating officer, was a signature I recognized. Different names, but the same handwriting style, the same coded notations. "Harrow did not work alone," Garrett said. "There is a network, mine owners, territorial officials, railroad executives. They have been doing this across Colorado, Montana, Wyoming." I stared at the papers. Part of me wanted to throw them in the forge and pretend I had not seen them. I had earned peace. I had earned rest. But Samuel's badge hung heavy on my chest. "How many towns?" I asked. "At least 7 that I have found, probably more." Thomas had been working the bellows, but he stopped now. "What are you going to do?" I looked at the badge, then at Thomas, then at the mountain visible through the shop's open door. "I am going to finish what we started," I said. Rose came to the shop that evening. Moira was with her. Garrett stood by the forge. Jacob sat at the workbench, his pen ready. Thomas held the documents. "You are going after them," Rose said. It was not a question. "Yes." "Then we are coming with you." I started to object, but she cut me off. "I can document the evidence. Moira can analyze the financial records. Jacob can take testimonies. Thomas can help you investigate. And Garrett has the authority to make arrests." "This could take years," I said. "Then we have years," Rose replied. Moira spoke quietly. "My father destroyed lives to build his power. I want to help destroy the power that destroys lives." Jacob wrote on his slate, "For everyone still underground." Thomas simply nodded. I looked at this group of people who had been broken by the same machinery of greed and corruption, who had every reason to hide and heal and never speak of these things again, and who were choosing instead to fight. "It will be dangerous," I warned. "Living is dangerous," Rose said. "This gives danger a purpose." We began that night. Garrett sent telegrams to marshals in 7 territories. Rose started organizing the evidence into a comprehensive report. Moira created a financial analysis showing patterns of payoffs and bribes. Jacob drafted witness protection protocols. Thomas prepared travel supplies. I stood at the forge, heating iron for horseshoes we would need for the journey ahead. The metal glowed red, then orange, then white. I shaped it with hammer and anvil, the rhythm as familiar as breathing. 10 years ago, I thought this work was behind me. 5 years ago, I thought peace meant isolation. Now I understood that peace was not the absence of struggle. It was the presence of purpose. The memorial stood in the town square, lit by lamplight. 14 names that would not be forgotten. And beside it now, a small wooden board with a new message, painted by a child from Rose's school. When you remember the dead help you remember how to live. I did not write those words, I did not know who did, but they were true. The mountain watched over Coldwater as it had for 1,000 years. It had seen towns rise and fall. It had seen justice and injustice play out in the valley below. It kept no record, offered no judgment. It simply stood, bearing witness to everything. I locked the blacksmith shop for the night and walked home under a sky full of stars. Thomas was already asleep, his whistle resting on the table beside his bed. I sat on the porch and looked at the badge pinned to my coat. In 3 days, we would leave for Silver Creek. We would find the same lies, the same corruption, the same powerful men who believed some lives mattered less than profit. And we would bring them the same reckoning we had brought to Coldwater. Not with violence, with truth, with memory, with the simple, stubborn insistence that every name mattered. Every life counted. Every death deserved to be investigated. The wind came down from the mountain carrying the scent of pine and snow. I had spent 10 years listening to that wind, learning its moods and meanings. I knew when it promised storms. I knew when it promised change. Tonight it promised both. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. Another answered. Life continued in the forest, indifferent to human drama, following patterns older than towns and laws and justice. But we were not indifferent. We could not afford to be. I stood and went inside, closing the door softly so as not to wake Thomas. Tomorrow we would prepare. The day after we would plan. And then we would ride out to the next town where the truth had been buried and begin the slow work of excavation. It would not be easy. It would probably not even be fully successful, but it would be right. And after 10 years of exile, after a decade of silence, after all the names that had been forgotten and the stories that had been erased, right was enough. I took off the badge and polished it carefully before setting it on the mantel beside a photograph of Samuel, young and smiling, holding baby Thomas. Father and son, both stolen by the same greed, both avenged by the same stubborn refusal to let lies win. We will finish this, I said to the photograph. All of it, for every name in every town. I promise you that. The fire crackled. The wind moved through the pines. And somewhere in a territorial prison, Caleb Harrow lay awake in his cell, staring at the ceiling, counting the cost of every choice he had made. In the town square, the memorial stood watch over sleeping Coldwater. 14 names carved in stone. 14 lives that would not be reduced to statistics. 14 stories that proved the simple truth that no amount of power or profit or progress justified forgetting that each person who died was someone's entire world. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and indifferent. But we were not stars. We were human. We remembered. We grieved. We fought. And that made all the difference. 6 weeks later, we rode into Silver Creek under a gray autumn sky. The town looked like Coldwater's twin. Same wooden storefronts. Same church steeple. Same mine entrance carved into the mountainside. Same lies buried beneath prosperity. But this time, we were not alone. This time, we had evidence. This time, 14 names carved in stone reminded us why we came. Thomas rode beside me, his apprentice blacksmith tools wrapped in oilcloth. Rose carried her teaching materials and a notebook filled with questions. Moira had ledgers. Jacob had testimony forms. Garrett wore his badge. We were not an army, we were witnesses. And witnesses, I had learned, were harder to kill than heroes. The Silver Creek sheriff met us at the town line, young, nervous, his hand near his gun. "State your business," he said. I showed him my badge. "We are here about the mine accidents." "Those were investigated, all accidents." "Then you will not mind if we investigate again." His hand moved closer to his weapon. Behind him, I saw faces in windows, watching, judging, deciding if we were threat or salvation. It was the same choice Coldwater had faced. Thomas spoke quietly. "We are not here to destroy your town, Sheriff. We are here to save it from the people who already are." The sheriff's hand relaxed, just slightly. "How long you planning to stay?" "As long as it takes," I answered. We rode into Silver Creek as the sun broke through the clouds. Somewhere in this town there were names waiting to be remembered, families waiting for truth, and powerful men who believed they were untouchable. They were wrong. Rose rode up beside me. "Are you ready?" I looked back at the road we had traveled, then forward at the road ahead. "I have been ready for 10 years, I said. "I just did not know it yet." We dismounted in front of the Silver Creek mining office. Through the window, I could see a man in an expensive suit studying paperwork. He looked up, saw us. His face went pale. He knew. They always knew. Garrett stepped forward and knocked on the door, and we began again. I went to bed knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new revelations, new battles in a war that might never fully end. But I also went to bed knowing I was not alone. That Thomas slept safely in the next room, that Rose and Moira and Jacob and Garrett were preparing for the same journey, that a town once built on silence had learned to speak. The rope that had waited for my neck a year ago now hung in the sheriff's office, a reminder of how close we had come to letting injustice win. But we had not. We had chosen differently, and we would keep choosing every day to remember rather than forget, to speak rather than silence, to stand rather than hide. That was the only way mountains moved, not all at once, but stone by stone, name by name, truth by truth, until the weight of what was right finally outweighed the inertia of what was easy. I closed my eyes and dreamed of 14 people I had never met, standing in a meadow full of wildflowers, finally at peace because someone had cared enough to say their names. And in the morning, we would say more names. We would tell more stories. We would bring more light to more darkness, until every mountain listened, until every town remembered, until justice was not just a word carved on a courthouse, but a living practice that honored the simple truth that every human life, no matter how poor or powerless, mattered as much as the richest and most powerful. That was the promise. That was the work, and we would not stop until it was done. The end.